Welcome to the Mac 27 collection. In this video, we'll be taking a look at my PowerMac G4 Cube. Of course, the G4 Cube is a pretty special and unique machine, and it needs no introduction to any enthusiast or collector of vintage Macs. So I won't be getting into the whole history and backstory of this machine in this video. I personally believe this is the most beautiful Mac, and maybe the most beautiful computer ever made. Its industrial design is just gorgeous, as we'll see later in the video. Of course, it's also, unfortunately, one of the most famous flops that Apple's had in the last 25 years. So with these two factors, and for other reasons, this makes it one of the most collectible and desirable Macs of all time. The G4 Cube was launched at Macworld New York in July 2000, and it was discontinued, or put on ice, according to Apple, less than a year later in July 2001. As we look at the packaging here, we can see a great example of this sort of photography and artwork style that Apple was using on its boxes during this era. These kind of zoomed in, beautifully lit shots of its products. I think it's really cool, and this is hands down my favorite example on any of the boxes from around this time. On the top of the box here, we can see that Apple was emphasizing that they had really designed a whole system for the Cube. So not just the Cube computer itself, but they had also designed these beautiful stereo speakers in conjunction with Harman Kardon that are shown on the right, as well as the newly released optical Pro mouse and the Pro keyboard as well. This particular system originally shipped with the standard 450 MHz PowerPC G4 processor, 64 megabytes of RAM, a 20 gigabyte hard drive, and a DVD-ROM drive. The RAM and the hard drive have since both been upgraded. The stock Rage 128 graphics card has also since been upgraded by the original owner, who swapped in a GeForce 2MX card. This is a really great upgrade, as it's required to drive the large later ADC flat panel displays, and more on that later. So without any further ado, let's get to the unboxing. First, we'll remove the accessories cover. On the top layer here, first we have the Apple Pro keyboard. This is the standard M7803 keyboard that shipped with all desktop Macs during this time. Next up, we have the software disk packet for the Cube. There's the part number for that. Note that this is a slightly earlier system that shipped with OS 9.0.4. Next up, we have the documentation packet. And there's the part number for that as well. Here we have the Apple Pro mouse for the Cube. Here we have the modem cable. And the power cable. This one has translucent connectors. Here we have the 6-pin to 4-pin FireWire cable. Apple was really pushing DV or digital video from camcorders during this era with iMovie. Here we have the angled VGA adapter that was specially made for the Cube, so you could connect a standard VGA display to the port on the bottom of the Cube at an angle. And finally, we have the USB extender cable. You may have noticed on this top piece of styrofoam there's a small label that's kind of faded now, but it shows all the different part numbers of every piece that's shipped in this accessory kit from the factory. So if you're a Cube owner with the original box for your system, you can make exact determinations about what specific components shipped with your system. Now we can go ahead and remove the top piece of styrofoam. We can then go ahead and remove this smaller piece of foam as well that covers up the speakers. Now we can go ahead and lift the Cube itself up and out of the box. Next, we have the external power supply for the Cube. And finally, we have the speakers. These have the external amplifier that's attached on the cabling. And there's this little piece of foam the speakers sit in that's separate as well. This is the original foam shipping bag for the Cube, which is kind of an interesting shape. So we'll go ahead and remove that now. Before we get to the Cube itself, though, let's take a look at some of the other parts of the system. Here we have the external power supply for the Cube, and this is pretty infamous among Cube owners for being just gigantic and very heavy. It uses this rather unusual 4-pin connector to connect the DC input to the Cube itself, and the entire thing is ventilated. It gets pretty toasty during operation, actually, and on the bottom here there's some labeling that's a little bit hard to read given the white ink. And yeah, this thing is pretty large and bulky, coming in at over 3 pounds or 1.5 kilograms. For context, the actual Cube computer itself is only about 13 pounds or about 6 kilograms. Here we have the Pro speakers that shipped with the Cube. This is the special Cube Bespoke USB version. We'll go ahead and remove this shipping bag from the amplifier. And much like the keycaps on the Pro keyboards, the amplifier has this dark translucency to it. It's pretty beautiful in my opinion. This also has a Kensington lock slot on the bottom for security purposes, and a headphone jack on the front. Much like the other Pro speaker models that Apple shipped as standalone accessories you could buy with Macs during this time, these shipped with these beautiful little removable covers that protected the drivers just a little bit. Again, this version of the speakers shipped with a USB connector, and officially speaking, they only worked with the Cube. Here's a comparison of these speakers with the amplifier and the USB connector on the right, with on the left here the standalone Pro speakers, which have the proprietary Apple 2.5mm speaker mini jack. The drivers and the acrylic enclosures, however, are otherwise identical. Of course, the industrial design of these speakers is really gorgeous in my opinion. These acrylic enclosures with the little rubber feet here for you to sit them on your desk. Unfortunately, the black surrounds on these speakers are very prone to the degradation or rot issue that's pretty well known in the community, wherein the material itself is prone to microbial degradation. This usually looks something like this, seen here on one of my spare sets of these speakers, where this green sort of growth accumulates on them, and over time the surrounds become sticky and very brittle, similar to dry rot. And eventually the surrounds can develop large holes like this, seen on another one of my spare sets, and ultimately the surrounds just fall apart and need to be replaced. Luckily, as you can see, these are still in fairly decent condition on this particular set, but replacement of the surrounds is advisable and is possible, thankfully, with newly made parts. And this is something that I intend to pursue on mine at a future time. Here are all the rest of the accessories for the Cube: the Pro keyboard and mouse, the documentation and software CD materials, the power cable, the other cables, modem, FireWire, USB, and the VGA adapter. Here are all the documentation and software disk materials spread out. We have warranty, license, and AppleCare information, the setup and about guides, software coupons, the speaker info sheet, the original Apple stickers, and all the discs. We have one software install, software restore, an Apple hardware test disc, and an iMovie 2 disc as well. We'll take a quick look inside the setup guide here. They make it pretty easy. Just set up the external power supply, connect your power, connect your video. You can see Apple was really pushing ADC during this time. Connect your keyboard and mouse and the speakers, and turn on the system. Pretty simple. Next, we'll check out the About the PowerMac G4 Cube manual. This one's pretty interesting. We start out with some setup information that overlaps a fair bit with the setup guide we looked at previously. In this documentation, however, Apple points out the importance of airflow going through the core of the Cube. They also mention you can adjust the adjustable foot on the keyboard as well. And here we have the system set up. This next section is pretty interesting to me. This is getting to know your computer. They point out all the different parts and aspects of the system here, all the different ports and things. They also give you an overview of the core of the system that we'll see shortly. And then it moves into some generic QuickTime information and things like that. But then we get into another section called Using Your Computer. They talk about how to adjust and use the keyboard and the mouse, how to adjust the speaker guards, how to use a USB hub, and things like that. They also show you how to insert a disk into the vertically mounted optical drive, how to remove the core of the computer for upgrading, and how to reinstall it. And of course, finally, here we have the Cube itself. As I said at the beginning of the video, I personally believe this to be the most beautiful Mac, and thereby maybe the most beautiful personal computer ever made. I just think that the industrial design is a standout and it's absolutely gorgeous. I love how the computer's internals are suspended in this stunning crystal clear enclosure, to use Apple's words, and Steve Jobs famously loved this design and this machine, describing it as a wonder of engineering and design in an 8-inch cube on stage at Macworld at its launch. Of course, it has no internal fan, as you may know, but it also has no internal speaker, necessitating the use of the external drivers with this system. Overall, this might be my single favorite piece in my whole collection. It's gorgeous, and as a result, I keep it on display quite a lot, whether it's in the collection studio or on my personal desk, and I just love looking at it. And it makes a cool conversation piece as well. Of course, the acrylic shell is very easily scratched and damaged, so you have to be very careful with it. This one, fortunately, as you can see, has been very well taken care of over the years by the original owner and then by myself. But I have also polished the case using the 3-step Novus plastic polish product. This is an excellent product I've used on many of my Macs over the years. I'll put a link to it in the description, and I would highly recommend it to any Cube owners or owners of other acrylic vintage Macs. On the top of the Cube, from rear to front, we have a smaller ventilation grill for the video card, a touch sensor for the power, the main ventilation grill for the center of the system, and then in the front is the slot for the slot-loading DVD-ROM drive. If you look very closely on the exterior of the case, each side has these small little circular cutouts for airport signals to pass through. There's one on the right side and on the left side as well. Of course, the Cube has a vertically mounted slot-loading DVD-ROM optical drive up front here. This is how the disc is loaded to be inserted and removed. Unfortunately, I can't demo this for you because the rollers on mine need servicing and aren't working so well anymore, but it looks pretty slick when it's working well. If you look very closely at the acrylic shell of the Cube, particularly on top near the 2 metal screw posts, you may notice these very, very faint little lines that are in the plastic. These are not actually stress fractures or cracks, rather they're just molding imperfections left over from manufacturing. So these are very normal, they're present on pretty much all Cubes, and mine also happens to have a third one here present near the rear ventilation grill as well. Externally, the only text printed on the case is on the rear here, where we have the model name and other regulatory information. On the bottom of the computer is the handle for removing the core, as well as a Kensington lock slot for security, and we also, of course, have all the I/O here. We have Ethernet built in, 2 FireWire for 100 ports, 2 USB ports, the 56K modem, the DC power input jack from the power supply. We have the interrupt and reset buttons, as well as the ADC and VGA video out ports. The original specifications for the system are also listed on the bottom on this little label here. To remove the core of the computer, we first push down on the handle and it pops up. And then you can lift the core right out. And of course, it can also be reinstalled just as easily. It really is quite a feat of engineering, in my opinion, to be able to do that. Obviously, this requires the user to disconnect all cables and to flip the computer over on their desk, but it is still pretty neat. Of course, this then gives the user access to pretty much every component inside the system, from the memory to the hard drive, the airport card, and even non-user upgradable parts as well. So the Cube, while it did offer good expandability inside for what it is, of course, as you can see, it still can't fit full-size PCI cards in here. And so limited upgradability in that regard is one of the downsides to the Cube. However, it does give you pretty good access to work on most things, although there are varying degrees of ease of repairability on some components. So let's take a closer look at the core. Here we have the front plate over the slot-load DVD-ROM drive, one of the airport antennas at top left, and then behind this usually is where the spinning hard drive sits, but in this case it's been replaced with an mSATA SSD. You can see the red adapter board back in there. It's a little bit hard to get an angle on to view it, but there's the adapter board and the thin black SSD. Behind that is the mechanics for the handle assembly and the heatsink. Then we have the RAM here at the left, as well as the video card with ADC and VGA on it. We have the VRM or voltage regulator module, the motherboard, some connector cables, another airport antenna at top right, and of course the airport card. And then on the top side of the core here, we have the touch sensor assembly for the power button. The Cube does not have a physical power button that moves. It's pretty cool. I'll show you that later. And just if you were curious, this is what the inside of the case shell looks like with the core removed. This inner metal piece is also removable, but I won't go through that process just for the purposes of this video. So let's go ahead and set it up. First we'll connect the video. This is an ADC connector. It's a modified version of DVI that Apple was using on all of its displays at this time. It clicks into place with a nice satisfying snap. Next, we'll connect the DC power input from the power supply. And finally, we'll connect the USB speakers. Then we'll go ahead and connect mains power to the power supply. Then we'll connect the USB keyboard to the display. And we'll use one of the two USB ports on the keyboard to connect the mouse. And we can also go ahead and raise the adjustable foot on the keyboard for a more comfortable typing angle as well. Then we can go ahead and turn it on. As I alluded to earlier, the Cube does not have a physical power button or switch that moves. Rather, it's just a touch sensor on the top of the Cube, which is pretty cool. There's also a status LED that glows when the system is on. My camera's refresh rate doesn't play well with it, but it's glowing steadily here. You can also press the touch sensor again to put the computer to sleep. So let's power up the Cube, shown here with the 22-inch cinema display. I'll show the boot up process into OS 10.3 Panther here in real time. Note that this machine is again booting off of an SSD, so it's nice and speedy and also pretty quiet. All the Apple displays from this era also have status LEDs on them as well, which is nice and helpful for feedback when the system is on. I usually run my Cube with the 22-inch cinema display here. It's a really great setup. Of course, on these systems you can also turn them on by pressing the power button on the display. I'll also show the system booting into Mac OS 9 as well. Another reason that this machine is one of my favorites is because it's obviously capable of booting not only the classic Mac OS in the form of OS 9 here, but also early versions of OS 10. And I find that 10.3 is usually the sweet spot on these for compromising between speed and performance. I currently have this Cube running on an SSD, and it's dual booting OS 9 and OS 10.3 Panther. And at the moment, I have Panther set up as the default boot drive, but you can obviously switch between this very easily in macOS. As you may know, holding down the Option key at startup after pressing the power button lets you select which drive or partition to boot from. And of course, under System Preferences in OS X anyway, it's very easy to pick which boot disk is the default. Overall, I really love using my Cube. It's an awesome system to have and to use. I find that the keyboard is pretty okay to use. It's a membrane keyboard, obviously, so there is a little bit of mushiness with the key feel, but overall, it's pretty good. I find the beautiful Pro mouse pretty nice to use. It only has the one button, but it also does have the adjustable force dial on the bottom, where you can select how hard it is to click. So now let's check out the system specs. Under About This Computer, we can see we're running under the Mac OS 9.0.4 partition on the SSD at present. We'll check out some more details in System Profiler as well. Here we can see that 450 MHz G4 chip. Under Devices and Volumes, we can also see, as I said, the OS 9 and OS 10 partitions on the drive. We can also see the upgraded GeForce 2MX graphics card. As I indicated previously, I usually run my Cube with the 22-inch Cinema display just for space purposes, and also due to the large real estate that it offers. Of course, the Cube also looks great with the 15-inch LCD Studio display seen here. It's definitely on the smaller side, but still gorgeous. As well as the 17-inch ADC CRT Studio display. While the 22-inch Cinema display is quite nice, this one is probably my favorite. I just think it's gorgeous and it complements the Cube so well. It is obviously also very heavy and takes up a lot of space, but it is a wonderful display. I'll be doing a separate video on this, of course, at a future time, but here it is with the Cube. I just think it's such an impeccable pairing. The transparent outer case, the one-piece acrylic stand with those really cool flowing lines. Just overall, this display is a treat to look at and to use. And so alongside the Cube, this is definitely one of the pieces I have out on display in my collection studio the most. Of course, the Cube system can also be turned on using the physical power button on the CRT display as well. Just like on the 22-inch Cinema display, it's an actual button that moves and has travel. This is unlike the button on the 15-inch LCD Studio display, which is a touch sensor instead. As I said earlier, I can also use the 20-inch Cinema display and the 23-inch Cinema HD display, both of which came out much later in 2002, with my Cube because it has the upgraded GeForce 2MX graphics card. I'm not going to show those in this video though because they don't quite match the aesthetic of the Cube as far as the color scheme with the logos. So that's just about everything for this episode. I hope you've enjoyed the video and taken a look back at this beautiful and iconic piece of computing history. As always, for more on this machine, check out the link in the description to its showcase page on my website. That's all for this video. Thanks for watching.